Between 1930 and 1940, somewhere between 400 and 1,000 contract murders were dispatched from a candy store on the corner of Saratoga and Livonia Avenues in Brownsville, Brooklyn. The store was called Midnight Roses. It was run by a woman in her 60s named Rosie Gold, who served malted milks and kept a wall of payphones along the back. Killers would sit at the counter sipping egg creams and waiting for one of those phones to ring. When it did, someone on the other end would give them a name, a location, and a fee, anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000. Then they'd finish their drinks and go to work. All of this happened underneath the elevated tracks of the number 3 train, in a neighborhood that at that very same moment had the highest concentration of synagogues in the United States, a mile-long commercial strip doing $90 million a year in retail sales, and a Yiddish-language theater scene that rivaled the Lower East Side. Brownsville was never one thing. That was always its trouble and its genius. The land itself started as a problem nobody wanted to solve. When the Dutch settled eastern Brooklyn in the late 17th century, they turned most of it into farms. But the stretch that would become Brownsville was low and marshy, prone to flooding, good mainly for quarrying stone and dumping waste. Fumes from the glue factories along Jamaica Bay drifted north and settled over the flats. It was inconveniently far from Manhattan, too far for anyone with money, close enough for anyone without it. In 1858, a landowner named William Sidham tried to parcel the area into 262 lots with simple worker housing. But he'd overestimated demand and underestimated how desolate the place was. He defaulted on his mortgages. The land went to foreclosure in 1862 and was picked up by a speculator from upstate named Charles S. Brown, who subdivided it again, named it after himself, and started advertising Brown's Village to the working class. By 1883, he'd put up about 250 small houses, cottages really, surrounded by meadows and a dairy farm. It was a modest beginning for a place that would, within a few decades, become one of the densest human settlements in the Western Hemisphere. The man who changed everything arrived in 1887. Elias Kaplan was a garment contractor who ran a shop on the Lower East Side. The sweatshop reform laws coming out of Albany were starting to squeeze his margins, and the labor unions on the East Side were growing aggressive. Strikes, pickets, organizers on every block. Kaplan looked at Brownsville and saw exactly what Charles Brown had seen, only from the opposite direction. Brown had seen cheap land for cheap housing. Kaplan saw cheap land where unions couldn't reach. He bought tracts, built a factory, put up tenements for his workers, and, in a stroke of either genius or audacity, installed a synagogue called Ohev Sholom inside the factory itself. Come to Brownsville, the pitch went. More room, cleaner air, and you can pray where you work. Other garment manufacturers followed Kaplan's lead, dragging their operations and their workforces across the East River. Furniture makers came, food processors, metal workers. Within 3 years, 10,000 Jews were living in Brownsville. By 1900, it was 25,000. The irony of Kaplan's calculation is that it backfired almost immediately. The conditions in Brownsville's new factories were, if anything, worse than the ones on the Lower East Side, and the workers he'd brought with him carried their politics in their luggage. The Knights of Labor organized. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union set up shop. The Brownsville Labor Lyceum became a headquarters for the Socialist Party, and the neighborhood started electing socialist candidates to the state assembly, and kept electing them from 1915 through 1921. 2 socialist mayoral candidates in 1929 and 1932 pulled roughly a quarter of Brownsville's votes. In January 1917, Leon Trotsky himself, freshly expelled from France and Spain, showed up at the Labor Lyceum for Russian Night, a bazaar with food, music, and dancing, just weeks before the revolution that would reshape the century. Kaplan had built Brownsville to escape radicalism. He built the most radical neighborhood in New York. The population surge, meanwhile, was staggering. The Fulton Street Elevated Railway opened in 1889, finally connecting Brownsville to the rest of Brooklyn. The Williamsburg Bridge opened in 1903, giving Lower East Side residents a straight shot across the river to the borough. Immigrants were settling in Brooklyn at a rate of 1,000 per week. By 1908, the population of Brownsville had blown past 100,000, and it was the single largest Jewish neighborhood in New York City. They called it Little Jerusalem, or in Yiddish, Yerushalayim de America. In 1910, 66% of the residents were first-generation immigrants, and 80% of those immigrants were from Russia. 70 Orthodox synagogues served the neighborhood. Most had been organized by Landsmannschaften, men from the same European town who banded together to worship and look after one another in the new country. The physical conditions were appalling. By 1907, 24 of every 25 housing units in Brownsville were tenements. Lots that had sold for $50 were fetching $3,000, a 5,900% return. So developers built as many apartments as possible on each parcel to make the math work. 8 families crammed into houses designed for 2. Many had no running water. The wooden construction meant fires were constant. The streets were unpaved. There were no sewers. Residents used the roads for that. There were no playgrounds. The only park was Betsy Head, and it wasn't much, though in 1936 the city added a monumental Art Deco public swimming pool there, one of 11 built simultaneously across the city under Robert Moses, each one designed to look like a civic temple. A tenement stairway collapse in 1935 killed 2 people and injured 43 others. The neighborhood's density had reached that of the Lower East Side, the very place everyone had fled. And yet the residents built institutions as fast as the landlords built tenements. The Hebrew Free Loan Association was organized in 1901 to extend small loans to people in temporary trouble, enough to ride out a slow season, buy tools, start a small business. The Brownsville Relief Hebrew Charity supplied coal and paid rent for families who couldn't manage. A children's library opened on Stone Avenue, reportedly the first library in the country dedicated entirely to children and children's books. And on the day it opened, the line of kids waiting to get in stretched down the block. The Brownsville Boys Club, founded in the 1890s, became one of the most important youth organizations in the borough, a place that pulled boys off the street corners and toward something more durable. Not all of them, of course. Some of those same street corners were producing a different kind of education entirely. And yet, there is a yet with Brownsville that you have to keep in mind through every chapter of this story. The place was dreadful, and it was thriving simultaneously, in a way that drove outside observers slightly crazy. The main thoroughfare was Pitkin Avenue, and by the 1920s it had become what the residents called the Fifth Avenue of Brooklyn, not with irony, but with something close to defiant pride. By 1942, the statistics were remarkable. 372 stores lining a mile-long stretch, including 8 banks, 43 menswear shops, bakeries, jewelers, furniture dealers, and restaurants. Combined, they employed 1,000 people and did an estimated $90 million in annual business, which, adjusted for inflation, comes out to somewhere in the range of $1.4 billion in today's money. The median household income in Brownsville in 1933 was about $2,500, double what a family earned on the Lower East Side, though still well below the middle-class neighborhoods of the outer borough. It was poor, in other words, but it was busy poor. It was buying and selling and building poor. On weekends, Pitkin Avenue was packed shoulder to shoulder, thousands of people promenading, shopping, arguing with street corner speakers, eating knishes from the vendors on Belmont Avenue, where the pushcart market stretched for blocks, pungent with pickled herring and half-sour cucumbers. Not far from Pitkin, on Belmont and Rockaway and Sutter Avenues, the commercial life was denser and more chaotic. Pushcarts on both sides of the street, hawkers shouting in Yiddish, the old world marketplace transplanted whole into Brooklyn. Rockaway Avenue became famous as a furniture mart. Sutter Avenue was another main shopping artery. The neighborhood supported more than 20 movie theaters, and in 1929 it got the crown jewel, the Loew's Pitkin, designed by Thomas Lamb, the most celebrated theater architect in America. Lamb had designed the Capitol Theater on Broadway, the Fox Theater in San Francisco, movie palaces from Johannesburg to Jakarta. The Pitkin seated 2,827 people. Its exterior was Art Deco with Mayan flourishes, the kind of facade that gave no hint of what waited inside. A Moorish foyer with majolica plaques and embroidered hangings. A women's lounge done in Persian style with oriental furnishings. A men's lounge displaying African tribal weapons. And the auditorium itself, which the Loew's chain called an atmospheric theater. A garden under a painted blue sky, enclosed by sculpted walls and carved balconies and towers. Stars performed there. Milton Berle, Jackie Gleason, Humphrey Bogart. Al Jolson gave his last performance on that stage. The Loew's Pitkin opened on November 23, 1929, precisely 24 days after the stock market crashed. That timing tells you everything about Brownsville's relationship with luck. The first film shown was a talkie called So This Is College, followed by a live stage review brought in from the Capitol Theater on Broadway. Comedians, magicians, acrobats, a musical act called Buck and Bubbles. 4 deluxe shows daily at 1:30, 3:45, 7 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. For a dime, later a quarter, a garment worker's kid from Sutter Avenue could sit beneath a painted sky and watch Casablanca, or Gone with the Wind, or the newsreels that brought the war into the neighborhood in flickering black and white. A woman named Sylvia Schilt, who grew up in Brownsville, later wrote that the Loew's Pitkin was our eye on the world. For people who had come from the shtetls of Russia and Poland, who worked in factories 6 days a week and lived in apartments where the bathtub was in the kitchen, that theater was the single most beautiful room they had ever entered. On Friday evenings, the rhythm of the neighborhood changed. As the Sabbath approached, the pushcarts emptied off the streets and the stores on Pitkin Avenue went dark, one by one. The aroma of Shabbos cooking, brisket, challah, chicken soup, drifted out of every tenement window. On Kol Nidre night, the holiest evening of the Jewish year, the entire avenue was shuttered and silent, and the sidewalks filled with families walking to one of the 70 synagogues. The contrast between the weekday chaos and that Friday stillness was something residents remembered for the rest of their lives, long after they'd left for Flatbush or Long Island or wherever the next step took them. It was in these same years, the years of the pushcarts and the Labor Lyceum and the Loew's Pitkin, that Brownsville made a different kind of history. On October 16, 1916, a nurse named Margaret Sanger opened a storefront at 46 Amboy Street, just off Pitkin Avenue. She had rented the space from a sympathetic Jewish landlord named Rabinovitz, who'd helped fix the place up, adding little touches to make the 2 small rooms look clean and serious. Sanger and her sister Ethel Byrne, also a nurse, and a friend named Fanya Mindell, who could translate between English, Yiddish, and Russian, had distributed flyers around the neighborhood in 3 languages. They didn't use the words birth control. That was illegal under the Comstock Act of 1873, which classified contraception as obscene. But the women of Brownsville understood. On the first morning, the line of Jewish and Italian immigrant women with baby carriages stretched around the block. 140 came that day alone. By the 9th day, the clinic had seen 450 patients. On the 10th day, an undercover policewoman walked in. She signaled. A squad of officers raided the storefront, arrested all 3 women, and shut the clinic down. At her trial, Sanger called 25 Brownsville women as witnesses, and their testimony, miscarriages, failed abortions, the unrelenting cycle of pregnancy and childbirth, was devastating. It didn't save her. She was convicted and sentenced to 30 days. When the judge offered her a pardon in exchange for a promise not to break the law again, she refused. That storefront on Amboy Street was the first birth control clinic in the United States, the beginning of the organization that would become Planned Parenthood. The building no longer stands. No plaque marks the spot. Brownsville in these decades produced human beings out of all proportion to its poverty and its size. Aaron Copland, who would become the defining voice of American classical music, Appalachian Spring, fanfare for the common man, grew up here. So did Danny Kaye. So did the impresario Sol Hurok, who brought the Bolshoi Ballet to American audiences. Max Fleischer, who gave the world Betty Boop and Popeye, came out of Brownsville. The historian Howard Zinn was raised in its tenements. The physicist Isidore Isaac Rabi, who won the 1944 Nobel Prize for his discovery of nuclear magnetic resonance, grew up on those same blocks. The art historian Meyer Shapiro spent 45 years on the Columbia faculty after leaving Brownsville. The literary critic Alfred Kazin, born in 1915 at 256 A. Sutter Avenue, to a house painter father and a dressmaker mother who sewed dresses at the kitchen table, wrote the definitive memoir of the neighborhood in 1951 called A Walker in the City. He was unsentimental about it. "We were the end of the line," he wrote. "We were the children of the immigrants who had camped at the city's back door in New York's rawest, remotest, cheapest ghetto." The prosperous residents, the ones who made enough to move to Crown Heights or Flatbush, were called all-rightniks by those who remained. Brownsville, Kazin noted, measured all success by our skill in getting away from it. But there was a shadow economy, too, and it grew out of the same tenement blocks and the same street corners. While the Labor Lyceum hosted socialists and the pushcart vendors haggled over herring, the boys who would become Murder Incorporated were growing up a few avenues over. The origins were local. Abe Relis, who would become known as Kid Twist, a name borrowed from an earlier Lower East Side killer, grew up in Brownsville and started running with street gangs as a teenager. So did Martin Bugsy Goldstein, Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, and Harry Happy Mayoni, a man whose face bore a permanent grimace. By the early 1930s, they had come to the attention of the men building the National Crime Syndicate, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, who needed a reliable enforcement arm to keep order across their expanding empire of gambling, prostitution, and labor racketeering. What Luciano and Lansky wanted was a team of killers who didn't know their targets. The anonymity was the point. If the executioner had never met the victim, there was no personal connection for a detective to trace. The headquarters was Midnight Rose's Candy Store at 779 Saratoga Avenue, right under the L. Rosie Gold kept the place open 24 hours. The killers lounged at the counter, drank her malteds, bet on Dodger games, and waited for the phones. The operation was run by Louis Lepke Buchalter, the most powerful labor racketeer in the country, and supervised by Albert Anastasia, whom the press called the Lord High Executioner. The killers were paid a retainer plus a fee per job. Pittsburgh Phil Strauss was the most prolific. Historians put his personal count at over 100. Relis favored an ice pick to the ear, a technique so precise that several of his victims' deaths were initially ruled brain hemorrhages. The reach extended from New York to California, Florida to Detroit. The press, when they finally learned what was happening, dubbed it Murder Incorporated. The operational model was disturbingly efficient. When the syndicate's commission decided someone needed to die, the order went to Anastasia, who called the candy store. Someone who knew the target, a finger man, would take the assigned killers to see what the victim looked like. Then the finger man stepped aside, and the killers, who had no personal connection to the target and would never be seen in the victim's usual circles, planned and executed the job. Because the murders were carried out by strangers, the crimes were nearly impossible to solve. Detectives would arrive at a scene and find no motive, no relationship, nothing to pull on. Murder Incorporated operated for nearly a decade before law enforcement even understood it existed. It ended as these things do, with someone talking. In January 1940, a police informant implicated Rellis in a 1933 murder. Facing the electric chair, Rellis flipped. It turned out he had a near photographic memory. He gave prosecutors the details of more than 200 murders, names, dates, locations, methods. The whole apparatus came apart. Buchalter went to the electric chair at Sing Sing in 1944, the only major mob boss in American history to be executed by the state. Strauss, Goldstein, Maione, they all followed. But Rellis never got to testify against the biggest target, Albert Anastasia. On the morning of November 12, 1941, while under 24-hour police guard at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, Abe Kid Twist Rellis was found dead on a landing 7 stories below his room window. The official ruling was accidental. He'd been trying to lower himself on a rope of tied bed sheets, they said. Nobody believed it. Anastasia had offered $100,000 for Rellis's murder. As someone in the syndicate supposedly put it, the canary could sing, but he couldn't fly. The corner of Saratoga and Livonia is today a bodega. When a reporter visited some years ago, the owner had no idea that his store had once been the dispatching center for the most prolific contract-killing operation in American history. The row of telephones is gone. The Malteds are gone. Mrs. Gold is long forgotten. Brownsville's Jewish era was already beginning to fade when Murder, Inc. went down, though nobody quite knew it yet. The real break came after the war, and it came in the form of a man who never lived in Brownsville, never particularly cared about it, and shaped its future more decisively than anyone who did. Robert Moses. The Housing Act of 1949 gave Moses, already the most powerful unelected official in America, the authority to declare neighborhoods blighted, seize the land through eminent domain, demolish whatever stood on it, and hand the cleared parcels to developers. This was called slum clearance, and Moses pursued it with the enthusiasm of a man who believed that poor neighborhoods were diseases, and the wrecking ball was the cure. The families he displaced, overwhelmingly black, overwhelmingly from places like Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant, needed somewhere to go. Moses channeled many of them to Brownsville. His reasoning, reportedly, was that Brownsville's socially progressive Jewish residents would be less likely to cause upheaval over an influx of blacks than the Italians of Bushwick or Greenpoint. It was a calculation as cold and specific as anything Elias Kaplan had made 60 years earlier. Once again, someone outside Brownsville had decided what Brownsville was for. In 1948, the New York City Housing Authority completed the Brownsville houses, 1,338 apartments across 27 buildings, bounded by Sutter, Stone, Dumont, and Rockaway Avenues. At its opening, the project was genuinely celebrated. Modern plumbing, central heat, clean walls, a vast improvement over the rotting wooden tenements it replaced. It was one of the first successfully integrated housing developments in the city. For a moment, it looked like the answer. But the answer kept multiplying. As Moses continued clearing other neighborhoods and pushing displaced families toward eastern Brooklyn, New York City responded by building more projects in Brownsville, each one larger than the last. The Tilden houses went up in 1961, the Van Dyke houses, the Howard houses, project after project, each a cluster of brick towers rising from concrete plazas, each absorbing thousands of the city's poorest residents. The numbers tell the rest. In the Van Dyke houses in 1956, the population was 57% black and 43% white, and barely 1% of residents received welfare. 7 years later, the development was 72% black and 15% Puerto Rican, and it had the highest rate of per capita arrests of any housing project in the city. The Jewish population, meanwhile, was leaving for Flatbush, for Borough Park, for Long Island. They were the ones who could leave, the ones whose wages had risen enough to reach the next rung. Between 1940 and 1960, the neighborhood's demographic composition reversed almost completely, from more than 90% Jewish to roughly 75% black and Puerto Rican. And the new residents arrived to find that the factories, the garment shops, the furniture makers, the food processors, the metal workers were shutting down. The jobs that had sustained Brownsville's first immigrant wave were evaporating just as the second arrived. Brownsville's black residents were poorer than the Jews who had lived there before them, and they had fewer options because they faced discrimination the earlier residents hadn't. Barred from certain public spaces, locked out of homeowner loans by redlining, trapped in a rental economy with no exit. What happened next was, in the clinical language of urban policy, neighborhood destabilization. In plainer terms, the place fell apart. Progressive organizations tried to hold the line. The Brownsville Neighborhood Council worked to build coalitions between black, white, and Latino residents. The Brownsville Boys Club opened its doors to kids of every background. There were genuine efforts at integrated civic life, block associations, tenant committees, shared recreation programs. But larger forces were working against them. Redlining made it impossible for black residents to secure homeowner loans, which meant they couldn't build equity, which meant they couldn't accumulate the wealth that would eventually let them leave on their own terms, or stay and invest. The government kept building housing projects, but stopped maintaining the schools, the streets, and the recreational facilities around them. By the mid-1960s, the unemployment rate in Brownsville was 17%, twice the citywide average. The neighborhood that had once sent Socialists to Albany and marshaled hundreds of charitable organizations now had the highest poverty rate in New York City. In 1968, Brownsville became ground zero for a crisis that shut down the entire New York City public school system. The city, under Mayor John Lindsay, had agreed to experiment with community control, an idea championed by the Ford Foundation, which issued a $44,000 grant to get the project started, creating locally elected school boards in 3 neighborhoods, one of them Ocean Hill, Brownsville. The teaching force at the time was nearly 90% white and heavily Jewish. The student body was overwhelmingly black and Puerto Rican. The new community board, led by a black administrator named Rhodey McCoy, dismissed 19 white teachers and administrators it deemed uncooperative with the experiment. Albert Shanker, president of the United Federation of Teachers, called it a violation of due process and demanded reinstatement. When the local board refused, Shanker led a strike, then another, then a third. Nearly 1 million students were locked out of school for a total of 36 days across 3 separate walkouts in the fall of 1968. The conflict was framed nationally as a battle between black community empowerment and union labor rights, between racial justice and institutional order. In Brownsville itself, it was more immediate than that. Parents trying to get their children a better education, teachers trying to keep their jobs, and everyone on both sides watching the neighborhood's last functional institutions crack under the pressure. The experiment in community control was eventually dissolved by the state legislature. The bitterness lasted decades. By 1970, the population of Brownsville was 130,000. 77% were black, 19% Puerto Rican, and most of them were poor. Unemployment was 17%, double the citywide average. In May 1971, residents took to the streets to protest cuts to Medicaid, welfare, and drug prevention programs. What started as a peaceful demonstration turned violent. The fire department fought more than 100 blazes in a single night. Windows smashed, banana stands overturned, children stealing rides on buses, the whole neighborhood seeming to combust at once. Mayor Lindsay took to calling the area Bombsville because of its concentration of burned-out buildings and vacant lots. On one block of Pitkin Avenue, the 5th Avenue of Brooklyn, the street that had done $90 million a year in business. Over 2/3 of the 16 storefronts sat empty. The Loew's Pitkin Theater, Thomas Lamb's atmospheric palace with its Persian lounges and painted sky, closed its doors in November 1971. The last films it screened were Shaft and The Split. It sat as a church for a few years, then a furniture store, then nothing. Just an 85-foot tall shell slowly rotting behind a fake wall somebody had installed in the foyer. The balconies sagged, the plasterwork crumbled, the carved towers and sculpted walls of that vast imaginary garden surrendered to water damage and pigeon droppings and time for more than 40 years. The 1970s bled into the 1980s, and Brownsville found its way onto the kind of lists no neighborhood wants. Crack cocaine arrived. Heroin was already there. The social infrastructure, schools, recreation centers, street maintenance, had been hollowed out by decades of disinvestment. The city poured money into housing projects and nothing into the spaces between them. At the triangle where Pitkin and East New York Avenues met Legion Street, there stood a war memorial, a monumental stone wall designed by sculptor Charles Carey Rumsey and architect Henry Beaumont Hertz. It had been installed in what was once called Zion Park, renamed from Vanderveer Park in 1911 to honor the Jewish community, and dedicated in 1925. A Star of David was carved into the stone. During the 1970s, the memorial was heavily vandalized, the Star of David defaced, the stonework chipped and spray-painted. A Jewish monument in a neighborhood that was no longer Jewish, honoring a community that had left. It wasn't restored until the 1990s. Marcus Garvey Village, a townhouse-style development with front doors and little gardens, was supposed to offer a gentler model of affordable housing, something that felt like a neighborhood instead of an institution. Instead, the houses became the home base of a local gang, and poverty in the development climbed to 40%. The Nehemiah Housing Project, organized by the East Brooklyn Congregations, a coalition of churches and community groups, did manage to build decent homes and place families in them with genuine success, creating blocks of owner-occupied row houses that remained stable for years. But it was a small bright spot in a very large, dark picture. By the time the crack epidemic peaked in the late 1980s, Brownsville had one of the highest crime rates not just in Brooklyn, not just in New York, but in the nation. People were afraid to walk through the NYCHA campuses after dark. A basketball court in the Brownsville houses on Rockaway Avenue between Riverdale and Livonia became known simply as The Hole, famous for producing some of the toughest street ball players in Brooklyn, but also for the violence that surrounded it. Today, Brownsville is home to the highest concentration of public housing in the United States. 18 NYCHA developments, 100 buildings, more than 10,000 apartments spread across just 1.2 square miles. The average household income, as of the last reliable survey, was about $30,000 a year. The average life expectancy is 75.1 years, 6 years below the citywide average. The incarceration rate, 1,698 per 100,000 residents, is 3 times the rate for New York City as a whole. A columnist for the New York Times wrote in 2012 that the quality of life improvements made under Mayor Bloomberg might have happened in Lithuania for all the effect they have had on the lives of people in Brownsville. The gentrification that has reshaped Red Hook, Bushwick, Bedford-Stuyvesant, neighborhoods that were nearly as distressed as Brownsville a generation ago, has not touched it. In a curious way, the density of public housing acts as a shield. There isn't enough private real estate to attract developers, and you can't flip a NYCHA apartment. Walk through Brownsville today and you can still read its history in the buildings, if you know how to look. Former synagogues have become churches, aluminum crosses bolted over weathered or chipped away Stars of David, the architectural palimpsest of a neighborhood that has reinvented itself so many times the layers show. An 80-foot-long mural on Pitkin Avenue called The Wall of Reflect was painted as part of an effort to change the neighborhood's reputation. The community gardens that have sprung up on vacant lots, and there are many, are often planted with vegetables that provide food for residents who can't afford the grocery store a few blocks away. Empty lots that once held tenements are now growing collard greens and tomatoes. Some of these gardens were supposed to be temporary, filling land that would otherwise sit unused. But when the city tried to sell the lots in the 1990s, residents organized to protect them. The journalist Ginia Belafonte made an observation about this that's worth sitting with. She called Brownsville's immunity to gentrification an unusual kind of promise, noting that because the neighborhood can't be gentrified, it also can't suffer the displacement that gentrification brings. Whether that's a promise or a prison depends, she conceded, on what comes next. What came next, at least in one case, was a peculiar form of resurrection. In 2008, a developer named Ken Olson, heading a firm called POKO Partners, bought the ruined Loew's Pitkin Theater for $8 million. 2 years later, he began a $43 million renovation, funded in part by Goldman Sachs and federal tax credits. The building was gutted and rebuilt, not as a theater, not as a cultural center, but as a charter school with commercial space on the ground floor. The Brownsville Ascend Charter School opened in September 2012. The retail tenants that moved in were a Dollar Tree, a Subway sandwich shop, and a Pizza Hut. The Art Deco terracotta facade, Thomas Lamb's Mayan flourishes, was restored and still gleams on Pitkin Avenue. Inside, there is nothing left of the Moorish foyer, the Persian women's lounge, the painted sky. The building was sold again in late 2017 for $53 million, a 563% return on the $8 million paid 9 years earlier. The real estate math, at least, still works in Brownsville. It always has. Pitkin Avenue itself, the street that Alfred Kazin called a combination of Broadway, Fifth Avenue, and Wall Street, still runs its mile through the heart of the neighborhood. In 2013, a city-sponsored business improvement district began trying to bring it back, funding streetscape improvements, attracting small businesses, stabilizing the remaining storefronts. The corridor is no longer empty, but it is not the Pitkin Avenue of 1942, when 1,000 people earned their living on that single strip, and shoppers came from across Brooklyn to buy furniture and suits and jewelry. It is a different street now, in a different Brownsville, carrying a different set of burdens, and the old ones, too. There's a thread that runs through every chapter of this story, and it's worth naming plainly. At every critical juncture, someone who didn't live in Brownsville decided what Brownsville would become. Charles Brown decided it would house workers nobody else wanted to house. Elias Kaplan decided it would absorb laborers he wanted to isolate from their own unions. Robert Moses decided it would receive the displaced families from his demolition campaigns across the city. The Board of Education decided it would be the testing ground for an experiment in school decentralization. NYCHA decided it would hold the largest concentration of public housing in the country. At every turn, the people inside Brownsville responded, with institutions, with activism, with commerce, with art, sometimes with violence. And at every turn, the next external decision arrived before the last response had finished taking shape. If there is a single image that holds all of this together, it might be the corner of Saratoga and Livonia, where the candy store used to be. Mrs. Rosie Gold is long dead. The payphones are gone. The elevated train still rumbles overhead. A man sells plantains and lottery tickets from behind a counter, in the same room where Abe Relis once sipped a malted and waited for someone to tell him who to kill. He doesn't know the history. He didn't ask. Brownsville didn't ask for most of what happened to it. The neighborhood sits where it has always sat, low, flat, at the end of the line, and it